The late afternoon sun spilled through the window of my little sewing studio, casting a warm, golden glow over the bolts of fabric stacked against the wall. I was elbow-deep in a wedding dress, one of those delicate, vintage pieces that needed more love than thread to bring it back to life. My fingers moved steady, guiding the needle through lace, when I heard the faint creak of the mailbox outside. Just another bill, I thought, or maybe one of those glossy real estate flyers that always found their way to me. But something made me pause, wipe my hands on my apron, and step out into the humid Savannah air. The mailbox was old, rusted at the hinges, but it held something different today. A thick, cream-colored envelope, the kind you'd expect for a wedding invitation or a lawyer's notice. My name, Eleanor Hayes, was typed in crisp, formal font across the front. No return address. I carried it back inside, the weight of it, heavier than it should have been, and set it on the cutting table next to a spool of silk thread. For a moment, I just stared at it, the scissors still in my hand, the air thick with the scent of cotton and dust. I knew before I opened it, call it a mother's instinct, or maybe just the ache of too many years spent hoping. I slid my finger under the flap, careful not to tear the paper, and unfolded the single sheet inside. The words were stark, printed in black ink, no flourish, no warmth. It's best you don't come to the Hayes family gathering. We need space for now. Natalie, my daughter's name, just her name. No dear mom, no love. Just Natalie, sharp and final, like a door clicking shut. I read it again, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something softer. They didn't. The studio was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest, where even the hum of the sewing machine felt like it was holding its breath. I pressed the letter flat with my palm, smoothing the creases, as if that could undo the sting. Outside, the old oak trees swayed in the breeze, their shadows dancing across the floor. I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen, hesitating. What do you say to a daughter who's just told you you're not wanted? Understood, I typed. One word, no period, no question mark. I hit send and set the phone down. It felt final, like signing my name on a contract I didn't want to sign. I walked to the window, my hands still dusted with chalk from marking fabric. The street was empty, except for a stray cat weaving through the grass. I'd left the iron on, forgotten, its faint hiss filling the room. I turned it off, folded the wedding dress carefully, and sat back at the cutting table. The letter lay there, staring up at me, its edges curling slightly in the humid air. I didn't cry, not then. I just sat, the weight of 38 years, settling over me like a quilt I'd stitched myself, thread by thread. Natalie, my only child, the girl I'd raised through every storm, had drawn a line, and I was on the wrong side of it. I folded the letter back into its envelope, tucking it beside a stack of pattern books. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. I stood, brushed the chalk from my hands, and stepped outside. The air smelled of magnolias, and something heavier, like regret. I closed the studio door behind me, but I couldn't close the door on the ache in my chest, not yet. I sat at the cutting table that evening, the letter still folded in its envelope, tucked away like a bruise I didn't want to touch. The studio was dark now, the only light coming from a small lamp in the corner, casting soft shadows over the spools of thread and half-finished patterns. My hands, still rough from years of pinning fabric, rested in my lap. I closed my eyes, and the years slipped backward, pulling me to a time when Natalie's laughter filled this very room, when her tiny hands tugged at my apron, begging to play with the scraps of silk dot. It was 33 years ago when Tom, my husband, left us. Natalie was just 5, too young to understand why her daddy didn't come home from the hospital. I can still see her standing in the doorway of our old house, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide and searching mine for answers I didn't have. His heart gave out, the doctors said. Too sudden, too final. I held her hand at the funeral, both of us dressed in black, her little dress a size too big, pinned at the hem because I hadn't had time to alter it. I promised her we'd be okay. I didn't know how, but I said it anyway, because that's what mothers do. That we sold the house a month later. The one Tom and I had bought when we were young and full of dreams, with its wide porch and creaky swing. It was too big, too empty without him, and the bills piled up faster than I could stitch seams. We moved to a small apartment on the edge of Savannah, a place with thin walls and a leaky faucet, but it was ours. I took every job I could find, mornings at a tailor shop, evenings hemming dresses for a bridal boutique, and weekends teaching sewing classes at the community center. My own dream, a little fashion label with my name on it, slipped away quietly, one missed sketch at a time, until it was just a memory I didn't talk about. Natalie was my world. She was bright, even then, always drawing designs in crayon on the back of my pattern paper, her curls bouncing as she chattered about being a famous designer one day. I saved every penny I could, skipping meals some days so she could have ballet lessons, new shoes, a chance at the life I never had. When she was 13, she won a spot at a private arts academy. I took out a loan to cover the tuition, telling myself it was worth it when I saw her face light up at the acceptance letter. "You're my hero, Mom," she said, hugging me so tight I could feel her heartbeat against mine. College came next. Natalie got a partial scholarship to a design school in New York, one of those places where the air hums with ambition. I cried the day she left, not because I was sad, but because I was so proud I couldn't hold it in. The rest of the tuition we pieced together with grants, odd jobs, and another loan I signed without reading the fine print. I told myself she'd make it big, that one day she'd pay it back, not in money, but in the kind of success that makes a mother's heart swell. I kept sewing, kept pinning, kept believing. When Natalie graduated, she came back to Savannah with stars in her eyes and a business plan for her own fashion studio. "It's going to change everything, Mom," she said, spreading sketches across my cutting table, "but I need a little help to get started." I didn't hesitate. I co-signed her first business loan, even though the bank manager raised an eyebrow at my income. When they balked at the second loan, I put up the sewing studio as collateral, the place I'd built from nothing, stitch by stitch, after Tom died. "It's just temporary," Natalie promised, her voice bright with certainty. "I'll make you proud, Mom, you'll see." I believed her. I always did. When her studio, Thread and Bloom, opened its doors in Atlanta, I drove up for the launch party. I wore my best dress, one I'd made myself, navy silk with a subtle shimmer. I stood in the back, watching Natalie shake hands with investors, her husband Ryan at her side, his family filling the front row with their tailored suits and loud laughter. No one asked me to join the photos. I didn't ask either. I just smiled, sipped my wine, and told myself it was her moment, not mine. The calls started to fade after that. At first, they were full of excitement, Natalie telling me about her first big client, a magazine feature, a runway show. I'd listen, my hands busy with needle and thread, my heart full. But over time, the calls changed. They weren't about sharing anymore. They were about asking, "Can you co-sign this line of credit, Mom? It's just for the lease on the new space." Or, "Can I use your name for this vendor contract? It's temporary, I swear." Each time, I said yes, because she was my daughter, because I trusted her, because I thought love meant saying yes. I never missed a birthday. I sent checks when she needed help with payroll, even when it meant dipping into my savings. I kept the studio running, taking on extra alterations to cover the bills. When Natalie got married, I flew to Atlanta, sat 3 rows back, and watched Ryan's family take center stage. I didn't mind, or at least I told myself I didn't. I clapped when they cut the cake, sent a gift I couldn't afford, and went back to Savannah the next day. Looking back, I see the distance growing, like a seam, slowly unraveling. I thought, it was just life, her building her world, me keeping mine steady. But that letter, sitting there on my cutting table, told me it wasn't just life, it was a choice. Natalie's choice. I opened my eyes, the lamp's light flickering now, the air heavy with the weight of memory. I'd given her everything, my time, my dreams, my heart, and, somehow, it wasn't enough. Or maybe, I realized, it was never about enough. Maybe, it was about something else entirely, something I hadn't wanted to see. The next morning, I awoke to the smell of coffee brewing and the faint hum of Savannah waking up outside my window. The letter was still on the cutting table, its edges curling in the morning light, but I didn't touch it. I poured a mug, black, no sugar, and sat on the porch swing, letting the creak of the chains ground me. The air was thick with summer, the kind that clings to your skin, and I tried to focus on the mockingbirds flitting between the oaks. But my mind kept drifting back to Natalie's words, to that cold, typed sentence that felt like a wall between us. I hadn't been looking for more proof, but it found me anyway. Later that day, I was scrolling through my phone, something I don't do often, when a post from my nephew Ethan caught my eye. It was one of those short video clips, a boomerang, showing a stack of elegant invitations, cream paper with gold foil, tied with a sage green ribbon. Ethan was waving one in front of the camera, grinning, his caption bold and bright, Hayes Family Gathering, a legacy moment. Can't wait for the farmstead vibes. I froze, my thumb hovering over the screen. The date was 3 weeks away. The location, a fancy farmstead just outside Savannah, the kind of place with rolling fields and string lights, where people pay to feel rustic. I hadn't received an invitation, not a call, not a text, not even a forwarded email. I scrolled through the comments, my heart sinking a little deeper with each one. Natalie's husband Ryan had written, "Epic weekend incoming." His sister chimed in with, "The Hayes crew knows how to throw a party. VIP vibes only." Someone else, a cousin I barely knew, added, "Can't wait to see the whole clan. Even the mayor's RSVP'd." I set the phone down, the mug of coffee cold in my hands. I'd spent years stitching this family together, and now I was the one left out of the pattern. I checked the mailbox that afternoon, half hoping I'd find an envelope that had slipped through the cracks. Nothing but a utility bill and a flyer for a local craft fair. I walked back to the studio, searched the cutting table, the kitchen counter, even the narrow space under the front door where letters sometimes got caught. Nothing. The absence felt heavier than the letter itself, like a silence that screamed. That evening, I called Ethan. I kept my voice light, asking about his new job at the architecture firm, letting him ramble about blueprints and deadlines. Then, casually, I mentioned, "The gathering. Sounds like quite the event," I said, my fingers tightening around the phone. "Oh, it's going to be huge," he said, his voice bubbling with excitement. "Natalie and Ryan have been planning it for months. They're even pitching it to some lifestyle magazine for a feature on family legacies." He paused, then added, "You're coming, right, Aunt Eleanor? You and Natalie, flying in together." I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat. "I don't think I'm going," I said, keeping my tone even. There was a beat of silence, then Ethan's voice, softer now. "Oh, I'm sure it's just a mix-up. I'll check with Natalie." I thanked him, hung up, and stared at the porch swing, its chains still swaying slightly in the breeze. It wasn't a mix-up. I knew it in my bones. The next day, I was having tea with Clara, my neighbor, on her front porch. Her roses were in full bloom, their scent mixing with the sweet tea in our glasses. My phone was on the table, set to speaker because I'd been expecting a call from a client. When it rang, Natalie's name flashed across the screen. I hesitated, then answered, thinking maybe she'd changed her mind. But it wasn't an apology. It was a call she didn't know I'd hear. "I just don't think it's a good idea to have her there." Natalie's voice came through, sharp and clipped. She'd bring up the past, all that small town stuff. "We're building a brand here, Ryan. The Hayes name needs to look forward, not backward." I froze, my hand gripping the glass so tight I thought it might crack. Clara's eyes met mine, wide with shock, but she didn't say a word. Ryan's voice mumbled something about optics and investors, and Natalie cut in, "It's not personal, it's just business." She wouldn't understand the vision. I ended the call. Before they could say more, the tea tasted bitter now, the air heavy with something I couldn't name. Clara reached across the table, her hand resting on mine, warm and steady. "You okay, Eleanor?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. I nodded, though I wasn't sure. I looked out at her roses, their petals bright against the fading light, and felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just the letter. It wasn't just the gathering. It was the truth I'd been avoiding for years. My daughter had chosen to erase me, not because of who I was, but because of who she wanted to be. I stood, thanked Clara for the tea, and walked back to my studio. The letter was still there, a quiet accusation on the cutting table. I didn't touch it. Instead, I picked up a pair of shears and started cutting fabric, the snip of the blades steady and sure. I wasn't ready to unravel completely, not yet. But I knew one thing. I couldn't keep pretending this was just a misunderstanding. Natalie had made her choice, and now, maybe, it was time for me to make mine. The morning after I heard Natalie's voice on that call, I woke up before the sun. The studio was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for you to make a move. I brewed a pot of coffee, the familiar gurgle of the machine filling the space, and sat at the cutting table. The letter was still there, its edges, softer now, like it had settled into the room's rhythm. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Natalie's words, both the ones she wrote and the ones she didn't mean for me to hear, were carved into me, sharp as a tailor's shears. I sipped my coffee. the mug warm against my palms, and thought about the years I'd spent stitching together a life for her. The loans, the late nights, the dreams I'd tucked away so she could chase hers. I'd always told myself it was love, that giving everything was what mothers do. But sitting there, with the first light creeping through the blinds, I wondered if I'd been giving to someone who'd stopped receiving long ago. I made a decision before the coffee went cold. I pulled the letter from its envelope, smoothed it flat, and tucked it into my purse. Then, I called Margaret, my lawyer, who still worked out of a small office on Bull Street, in a building that smelled of old wood and lemon polish. She'd been there when Tom and I signed our first will, her steady hand guiding us through the paperwork after Natalie was born. I hadn't seen her in years, but her voice on the phone was as calm as I remembered. "Eleanor," she said, "I was hoping you'd call. Come by whenever you're ready." I drove to her office that afternoon, the letter in my purse like a weight I couldn't ignore. Savannah was alive with summer kids on bikes, tourists snapping photos of the historic squares, but I barely noticed. When I stepped into Margaret's office, the air was cool, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like time slows down. She looked up from her desk, her glasses perched on her nose, and gave me a nod that said she already knew this wasn't a social visit. I set the letter on her desk, its cream paper stark against the dark wood. "Read it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the lines, her face unreadable. When she looked up, she didn't ask questions, just waited. "I want to change the deed to the studio," I said. "It's not going to Natalie anymore." Margaret leaned back, her pen tapping softly against a notepad. "You're sure?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. I nodded. I was sure. The sewing studio wasn't just a building. It was my life's work, built from the ashes of Tom's death, paid for with years of hemming dresses and teaching classes. It was worth $1.2 million now, a number that felt too big for the little shop with its creaky floors and faded sign. I'd always planned to pass it to Natalie, to give her a piece of the legacy I'd stitched together. But that was before the letter, before her voice on the phone. Before I realized she didn't want my legacy, she wanted my resources. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my purse and slid it across the desk. "Chloe Bennett," I said. "She's the new beneficiary." Chloe was 21, a single mom who worked part-time at the studio. Her hands quick with the needle and her smile quicker still. She'd started coming by a year ago, asking for odd jobs to pay for her daughter's daycare. She never asked for much, just showed up, worked hard, and brought me soup when I caught a cold last winter. Once, when I told her I was proud of her for balancing work and motherhood, her eyes welled up, and she hugged me like I was family. "She's not blood," I told Margaret, "but she's never taken me for granted. She's deferred college to raise her daughter, and I want to give her a chance to build something of her own." Margaret nodded, pulling out a stack of paperwork from a drawer. We spent the next hour going through the deed, the legal terms blurring together until they felt like a language I didn't speak. But I understood the important part. The studio, my heart's work, would go to someone who valued it, who valued me. I signed each page with care, my hand steady, the pen gliding across the paper like it was cutting a new pattern. With every stroke, I felt something loosen inside me, like a knot I'd been carrying for years was finally coming undone. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was clarity, the kind that comes when you stop pretending and start seeing. When we finished, Margaret slid the final document toward me. "It's done," she said. "Natalie will be notified by the end of the week." I stood, my purse heavier now with the weight of what I'd done. "This was meant for someone who understands what it took to build it," I said, my voice quiet but sure. "That's not my daughter anymore." Margaret didn't argue. She just gave me that same nod, the one that said she understood more. Then she'd say, I stepped back into the Savannah heat, the sun high and unrelenting. But I felt lighter, like I'd shed a layer of myself I no longer needed. I drove home, the radio off, the hum of the engine enough to fill the silence. That evening, I sat in the studio, the lamp casting a soft glow over the fabric bolts. I ran my fingers over a piece of lace, its edges delicate but strong, and thought about Chloe, about the life she could build with a chance I never had. I thought about Natalie, too, but the ache was different. No, not softer, but cleaner, like a wound that's finally stopped bleeding. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of it. I'd spent so long stitching together someone else's dreams, I'd forgotten what it felt like to hold the needle for myself. Now, I was ready to start. The days after I signed the papers felt different, like the air in the studio had shifted, lighter, somehow, but still heavy with something I couldn't name. I went back to work, threading needles, hemming skirts, letting the rhythm of the sewing machine steady me. The letter from Natalie sat in a drawer now, tucked beneath a stack of pattern books, out of sight but not out of mind. I thought I'd feel relief, but instead, there was a quiet waiting, like the pause before a storm breaks. The storm came faster than I expected. By the next morning, my phone was buzzing itself off the cutting table, Natalie's name flashing across the screen. One call, then two, then five. I let them go to voicemail, my hands busy pinning a dress, my heart not ready to hear her voice. By noon, there were 12 missed calls, 3 from Natalie, 2 from Ryan, and the rest from numbers I didn't recognize. Voicemails piled up, each one marked urgent, their little red notifications glowing like warnings. I ignored them, focusing on the fabric under my fingers, the soft snip of scissors cutting through silk dot. Then the text started. "Mom, what did you do?" Natalie's first message read, the words sharp even through the screen. "This is insane. Call me now." Another from Ryan. "We need to discuss the studio. This affects everything." I set the phone face down, its vibrations muffled against the table. Outside, the Savannah sun was high, the oak trees casting dappled shadows across the sidewalk. I stepped onto the porch, needing air, needing space. Clara was in her garden, pruning her roses, and she glanced over, her eyes catching mine. "They're circling, aren't they?" she said, her voice low, knowing. I nodded, managing a small smile, but didn't say more. That evening, I played the voicemails, standing at the kitchen sink with a glass of water in my hand. Natalie's voice came first, tight and high-pitched. "Mom, you can't just give the studio away. Do you know what this does to us? To the business? You're throwing away our future." Ryan's was next, smoother but colder. "Eleanor, this is a mistake. We're in the middle of a major expansion, and the studio was part of our collateral. Let's talk this through." The third was from a man named Victor Lang, introducing himself as their attorney, his tone clipped and professional. "Mrs. Hayes, we urgently request a meeting to discuss your recent actions regarding the property deed. This has significant implications for all parties involved." I deleted each one, the sound of the trash icon oddly satisfying, like tearing a seam that didn't fit. I thought that might be the end of it, but I was wrong. The next afternoon, Natalie showed up at the studio. No call, no warning, just the sharp rap of her knuckles on the door. I was in the middle of measuring a bolt of chiffon when I looked up and saw her through the glass, her face set, her navy blazer too crisp for the humid Savannah air. I opened the door, stepping aside to let her in, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't want Clara or the neighbors hearing what was coming. She walked straight to the cutting table, her heels clicking against the hardwood, like she still owned the place. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" she said, her voice low but sharp, like a needle slipping too fast. I closed the door behind her, my hands steady, and sat across from her. The same table where she used to color her sketches as a child, her crayons scattered among my threads. "You tell me," I said, my voice calm, though my heart was pounding. "You changed the deed," she said, leaning forward, her eyes flashing. "The studio, my inheritance, you gave it to some girl who barely knows you. Do you have any idea what this does to us, to Thread and Bloom? We're in the middle of a funding round, Mom. Investors are watching, and now you've made us look unstable." I folded my hands in my lap, the fabric of my apron soft against my fingers. "You didn't invite me to the gathering," I said, keeping my eyes on hers. She blinked, caught off guard. "What?" she said, her voice faltering. "The family gathering," I repeated. "Everyone got their gold foil invitations weeks ago. I didn't even get a text." She sighed, the kind of sigh that says, "You're being unreasonable, that you're missing the point. That's not what this is about, Mom. It was an oversight, a mistake. You're blowing this out of proportion." "Was I invited?" I asked, my voice still even though it felt like a thread pulling tight. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her silence louder than any answer. I nodded, the ache in my chest sharp but familiar. "That's what I thought." She leaned forward, her voice softer now, almost pleading, but I could hear the calculation behind it. "We can fix this," she said. "We'll say it was a misunderstanding, a clerical error, reassign the deed, and we'll smooth it over. No one has to know. It's about the family, Mom, about our legacy. I stood then, my chair scraping softly against the floor. You stopped being my family when you decided I was an embarrassment, I said, my words quiet but firm. You used me for years' loans signatures. My studio then pushed me out when I didn't fit your brand. This isn't about a gathering, Natalie. It's about 30 years of me giving everything and you taking it without looking back. She stared at me, her face a mix of shock and something else. Something like guilt, but it passed quickly. You're being unfair, she said, standing to her blazer smoothing itself as she moved. We'll talk to our lawyer. This isn't over. She walked out, the door closing with a soft thud, leaving the studio silent again. I stood there, the chiffon still draped across the table, its edges frayed from my measuring. I didn't follow her. I didn't call after her. I just sat back down, picked up my shears and started cutting again. The snip of the blades, steady, grounding. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what she'd do next. I'd made my choice, and it wasn't about revenge. It was about saving what was left of me. The studio felt quieter than usual the next evening. The kind of quiet that settles in after a storm, when the air is still but charged. I was alone, sorting through a pile of fabric scraps, the lamp casting a soft glow over the cutting table. Natalie's visit had left a mark, not on the room but on me, like a seam stitched too tight, pulling at the edges. I'd made my choice, signed the papers, given the studio to Chloe. I thought I'd seen the worst of it, her anger, her accusations, but I was wrong. The real blow was still coming. My phone rang just as I was locking up, the sound sharp against the evening hush. It was Margaret, my lawyer, her name glowing on the screen. I answered, expecting an update about the deed, maybe some paperwork I'd missed, but her voice was different, lower, the kind of tone you use when you're delivering news someone won't want to hear. Eleanor, she said, pausing just long enough to make my stomach tighten, there's something you need to know. I didn't want you hearing it from anyone else. I sat on the edge of the cutting table, the wood cooler against my hands, and braced myself. Go on, I said, my voice steady though my heart wasn't. Margaret took a breath. A month ago, Natalie submitted documents to transfer the studio's deed into her name. She used an old contract you signed for one of her loans, forged it to look like you'd authorized the transfer. She was planning to use the studio as collateral for a high-risk loan to fund Thread and Bloom's expansion. I closed my eyes, the words sinking in like stones. If you hadn't changed the deed when you did, Margaret continued, she might have gotten away with it. You could have lost the studio, Eleanor, and been left liable for the debt if the deal went south. I didn't speak. I couldn't. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, like the weight of 38 years had collapsed into this moment. Natalie hadn't just pushed me out of her life. She'd tried to take the one thing I'd built with my own hands, the place where I'd poured my grief after Tom died, where I'd stitched together a future for us both. She'd counted on my silence, my trust, my love, to slip it out from under me, and she'd almost succeeded. Was it legal? I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Margaret hesitated. Not entirely, she said. The forgery was sloppy, and the loan company was sketchy, a shell group out of Atlanta with a history of predatory deals. But Natalie was banking on you not noticing, on you staying quiet like you always have. If you hadn't acted, Eleanor, you could have been on the hook for millions. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. The phone pressed tight against my ear. Thank you, Margaret, I said, the words feeling too small for what she'd done. After we hung up, I sat there in the dark, the lamp's light pooling around me like a spotlight on a stage I didn't want to be on. I thought about the girl who used to sit at this table, her crayons scattered, her laughter bright. I thought about the woman who'd stood here yesterday, her eyes cold, her words sharper than any needle. Natalie hadn't just excluded me from a family gathering. She'd gambled with my life's work, my security, my heart, all to prop up her brand, her legacy. And she'd done it in secret, trusting I'd stay the same, trusting, giving mother I'd always been. I stood, my knees stiff from sitting too long, and walked to the drawer where I'd tucked her letter. I pulled it out, unfolded it, and read it one last time. Then, I tore it in half, the sound sharp and final, and dropped it into the trash bin by the door. It wasn't anger that moved me, not exactly. It was something colder, clearer, like the moment you realize a seam can't be saved and you have to cut it clean. I'd protected myself, not just emotionally but legally, financially, and I hadn't even known how close I'd come to losing everything. I locked the studio and stepped outside. the savannah night warm and heavy with the scent of jasmine. The stars were out, faint but steady, and I felt something settle inside me, not peace, not yet, but a kind of quiet resolve. Natalie had made her choices, and I'd made mine. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I'd spent too long stitching someone else's dreams. Now, it was time to start sewing my own. The morning after Margaret's call, I woke to a world that felt new, not because it had changed, but because I had. The studio was the same bolts of fabric stacked against the wall, the hum of the sewing machine waiting, but I felt different, like I'd shed a skin I'd worn too long. I brewed my coffee, poured it into my favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle, and stood at the window, watching the savannah sunrise paint the oak trees gold. Natalie's betrayal, the forged papers, the studio she'd tried to take, it all sat heavy in my chest, but it didn't break me. Not anymore. I drove to the bank that afternoon with Chloe by my side. She was nervous, her hands twisting the strap of her faded denim bag, her eyes darting around the lobby's high ceilings and polished floors. "I don't belong here," she whispered, her voice small. I touched her arm, steady and sure. "You do," I said. We sat with the banker, a kind woman with a soft southern drawl, and I explained the plan. The studio's profits would fund a trust for Chloe money, for her daughter's daycare, for college when she was ready, for a life she could build without breaking herself. I kept my words simple, my tone calm, but inside, I felt a warmth I hadn't known in years. Chloe listened, nodding, her eyes wide, until the banker slid the final papers across the table. "Thank you, Ms. Eleanor," she said, her voice catching, tears brimming. I smiled. "You earned this, sweetheart. I'm just holding the door open." We stepped outside, the humid air wrapping around us, and Chloe turned to me on the sidewalk, her face soft with something like awe. "No one's ever believed in me like this," she said. I pulled her into a hug, her head resting against my shoulder, and for a moment, I felt like I was holding the girl Natalie used to be, but I let that thought go, let it drift away like a scrap of fabric caught in the wind. Chloe wasn't Natalie, and I wasn't trying to replace her. I was learning to give where it was received, to love where it was returned. That week, I started volunteering at the community center, teaching sewing classes to young women, some barely out of high school, others carrying the weight of lives like mine. I showed them how to thread a needle, how to read a pattern, how to mend what's torn and make something new. I brought iced tea and made extra copies of my old pattern books. They were shy at first, their questions hesitant, but they kept coming back. It felt right, putting something into the world that didn't ask for my heart in return, that didn't expect me to shrink to fit someone else's design. One evening, after the dishes were done and the studio was locked, I opened the cedar box in the hallway closet. Inside was a photo of Natalie, 6 years old, her curls wild, holding a tiny dress she'd designed with my scraps, her smile brighter than the sun. I traced the frame with my thumb, the glass cool under my touch. "I let you go to save myself," I whispered, my voice soft in the quiet. "I love you, Natalie, but I love me now, too." I closed the box, set it back on the shelf, and turned off the light. The calls kept coming for a while. Natalie Ryan, their lawyer, their voicemails piling up like threads I no longer needed. A formal letter arrived, thick with legal jargon, demanding I reverse the deed. I left it unopened on the kitchen counter, next to a vase of Clara's roses, and went back to my work. Their words couldn't reach me anymore. I'd stepped off that path, and I wasn't going back. One morning, I packed a small suitcase, just enough for a few days, and drove toward Tybee Island, the ocean calling me like an old friend. The road was quiet, the marshes stretching out, gold and green under the dawn. I wasn't running. I was reclaiming something I'd lost long ago, my voice, my peace, my right to be whole. As the waves came into view, their rhythm steady and sure, I felt the last knot inside me loosen, the last seam come undone. Love is a funny thing. Sometimes it looks like sacrifice, giving everything until you're threadbare. Sometimes it looks like silence, holding your tongue to keep the peace. And sometimes it looks like walking away, choosing yourself when no one else will. If you've ever had to let go of someone you gave your all to, I hope you know you're not alone. You're stronger than you think, braver than you feel. Keep stitching your own story, one thread at a time. I'm here, reading yours, every single one. And here's what I've learned. After all these years of cutting and sewing, of loving and losing, The hardest patterns to follow are the ones we draw for ourselves, but they're the ones that fit best in the end. Trust your hands, trust your heart, and don't be afraid to cut away what doesn't belong.